Okay, welcome folks. I'm going to get started as people continue to trickle in. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Genevieve Smith. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. This is the third and final virtual brown bag on a series that we're hosting on inclusive artificial intelligence. Our session today is focused on the role of corporate governance and leadership in advancing inclusive AI. So artificial intelligence is slated to be the largest economic opportunity of our lifetime and will disrupt businesses across all industries. This series follows our recent work on mitigating bias in AI and a playbook we launched this summer for business leaders on the topic. The series has explored a deeper dive into 3 areas that strategies are needed and also explores how education and business schools can adapt to changing needs. Each of the events has therefore included voices of MBA students in addition to industry and other experts. I'm going to share some quick background similar to other brown bags in the series if you've joined us before, and then we'll delve into a discussion with our wonderful speakers. So AI is expected to add 15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030. Students that leave Haas and other business schools, as well as Berkeley and universities more broadly, will undoubtedly be interacting with AI. AI makes it possible to automate judgments. AI, and particularly machine learning, is increasingly used to make decisions and predictions affecting most aspects of our lives, such as whether someone will get a loan, which products are advertised to which consumers, who gets into university, which neighborhoods are targeted as high risk for crime, and more. AI has incredible potential to make decisions more efficient and cost-effective, while also promoting higher productivity and growth in the economy. And use of AI in predictions and decision-making can reduce human subjectivity, particularly when paired with useful tools like Google's inclusive documentation guidelines for developers. AI is also being used to help tackle issues in areas spanning climate change, inequality, financial inclusion, and healthcare. The UK government is funding a firm to design a machine learning system that spots potential safety concerns in a mass planned COVID vaccination program, for example. There are also other examples of AI and machine learning in particular being used to advance equity and inclusion. Trial Watch, for example, which was launched in May 2019 with funding from Microsoft's AI for Good initiative and the Clooney Foundation, monitors trials globally to highlight injustices and rally support for defendants whose rights have been violated in the criminal justice process. The program recruits and trains people to monitor trials and then has these individuals use an AI-enabled app which uses speech-to-text and language translation to capture audio, photos, and questionnaires. This AI makes information comparable and teases out trends. Leveraging the data and information, Trial Watch works with human rights experts to assess fairness of trials and shares reports with other stakeholders. This is exciting, but AI also poses risks. As we outlined in the playbook, AI can embed biases, produce discriminatory outcomes at scale, and pose immense risk to individuals, society, and business. In January of this year, Robert Julian Borchak Williams was in his office when he got a call from the Detroit Police Department telling him to come to the station to be arrested. He was held at a detention center for 30 hours after being arrested and released on a $1,000 personal bond. Mr. Williams marked the first known account of an American being wrongfully arrested based on a flawed match from a facial recognition algorithm. In our playbook, we highlight 7 strategic plays to mitigate bias in AI that uses machine learning. These plays are also necessary to make AI more inclusive, both in terms of an inclusive process of developing AI and having outcomes from AI systems that promote social inclusion. In the previous sessions we held this fall, we took a deeper dive into the first 2 buckets for strategies around teams and the AI model. Today, we're focused on the third bucket of strategies, looking at the role of corporate governance and leadership in advancing inclusive AI. So the plays here include establishing corporate governance for responsible AI and end-to-end internal policies to mitigate bias. So things like AI ethics governance structures and responsible AI principles is a good step. The 6th is around engaging corporate social responsibility, CSR teams to advance responsible and ethical AI and larger systems change. So CSR teams can work towards enhancing digital inclusion and empowering participatory data collection that enables communities to collect and control their own data. And the last is around using your voice and influence to advance industry change and regulations for responsible AI. For each of the plays, there are mini guides that delve into them with concrete steps for implementation, supporting tools and examples of leading companies. The mini guides in the playbook can be found at the link on the screen. So with that, let me introduce our wonderful speakers. We have Augustin Centillion, who is an MBA and MEng candidate here at Haas School of Business and the UC Berkeley College of Engineering. Before coming to Haas, he worked as a management consultant focused on designing analytic models to responsibly drive business impact using data. Matissa Hollister is a fellow at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at the World Economic Forum and the AI and Machine Learning Platform. She's also an assistant professor of organizational behavior at McGill. And Reena Jana is the head of content strategy and responsible innovation at Google, where she leads operational efforts for resources, thought leadership, and tools for practicing Google's AI principles. She also works with community engagement and writing leads to scale global awareness and action towards building socially beneficial, inclusive, secure, and scientifically rigorous AI systems. So thrilled to have these incredible speakers today. To get us started, I wanted to ask, the way that we've been thinking about inclusive AI is AI that's more inclusive, both in terms of the process of developing AI and having outcomes from AI systems that promote social inclusion and equity. What do you think? And does this approach resonate? Why or not? Why not? So would love the speakers to share their thoughts.
I guess I could start with one comment is just to add to that also, which is a big focus of the project that I'm leading with the World Economic Forum, as well as one that my colleague is leading, which is about also the responsible use of AI-based tools. So I think we have a variety of projects with the AI platform, and one of them is specifically focused on the technology creators and creating governance systems there. But the project I'm working on is on the responsible use of AI to do HR tasks. We also have a toolkit that's looking at for C-suite executives, and the focus there is much more on the users. And so also thinking about the way it actually gets implemented in a company and used by the users, as well as the system itself in the first place. But I mean, I think that's part of the outcomes. It's just there's sort of two halves of the outcome. It's designing the tool to have good outcomes, and then also making sure you're using the tool and mitigating any of the risks.
And then coming to that from a product design point of view, I think the question may be also around starting from inclusive teams as you're developing AI systems and ML models, et cetera. I think if we look at the larger history of product design and development, we can see the development of AI and ML systems in that trajectory, and see what sort of benefits occur when you do open up for inclusion on the teams that are building the technology, and finding potential new directions or gaps, things that might not have been seen if the team wasn't inclusive. So I'm going to go really far back in time, like over a decade ago. I used to be a journalist and covered innovation for Business Week and focused a lot on inclusive innovation. I remember reporting on Google and YouTube over a decade ago and looking at how technologies or engineers who looked at accessibility problems were coming up with solutions that could be used for many other people. So one example was closed captions for YouTube, where an engineer who was deaf realized that they could have a lot of benefit from enjoying YouTube content, but at that time, there might not have been closed captions and at scale. So bringing that point of view to the table in terms of product development, not only unlocked like a great user experience, but also other use cases for that design. So I know that's not necessarily AI, but just going into that history of product design and development and seeing the evidence over time. You see that with sort of crash test dummies in the automotive industries. You look at sort of environment design and the way air conditioning systems have been designed for certain demographics, et cetera. And then when you get other people to the table, you start uncovering not only how to open up the experience for others, but might even unlock new experiences that you could scale. So placing it in that trajectory.
Yeah, and I really like that. I think when I think about inclusive AI, one of the things I think it can do, especially in a business, sort of an MBA context, is to create new sources of opportunity for people to be able to find things that they hadn't been able to find previously, whether it's being eligible for, new job opportunities or loan opportunities that they wouldn't have had access to before, or helping businesses and customers find each other that maybe wouldn't have found each other, through normal channels, and sort of expanding that economic opportunity for everybody, I think is one of the big upsides that inclusive AI could have.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Matissa, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to tie that back together again, too, because I do think obviously diverse people involved in the product creation is important, not a guarantee, obviously. But I think that one of the things that we've been emphasizing is sort of sometimes these AI tools, especially in HR, get promoted as just because it's a machine and it's objective, it will by itself be fair and it'll have better outcomes, right? And I think the most innovative tools, and something we've been trying to emphasize, is that the tools that are really creating more diverse, like encouraging hiring more diversity stuff, are driven by people who really understand the problems in the system and are using AI simply as a tool to achieve a change that they want. It's not the AI tool itself that's creating the change. It's the innovators that are thinking like, oh, if we could hire in a different way or open up our opportunities, we could have so much more better outcomes. And that really 90% of the innovation comes from the idea of the creator and not the AI itself. The AI is just a hammer to get there. And so that's really where the two end up getting tied together, right?
Yeah, I think that actually brings up another question that I have around the priorities of leadership and how that kind of matters when it comes to developing inclusive AI. So we also talk in the playbook around these priorities of leaders and how leaders can really impact, what's developed and how it's developed. So if speed to market is the priority without kind of having responsibility as much of a priority, then that might trump ethical concerns that could come up, for example, or if there's emphasis on a product that balances accuracy and inclusiveness, or, even comes from a perspective where it's developing something to tackle a certain issue, then, the product development process and outcomes could look really different. So yeah, what do folks think about that? Maybe Matissa, if you want to start, since you were just kind of talking about that perspective.
I thought that I was getting out of starting first because I just stopped and I'm hogging the time. I think it's a really important thing. I think sometimes it's a bit of a false contrast, and I think that we want to get away from that. And the good news is that sort of increasingly society is valuing inclusivity, which means that it doesn't mean that taking these things into consideration are some waste of time, or I think companies are realizing that they're facing huge backlashes if they don't take ethically responsibility from the beginning. So the nice thing is that they converge. And I was talking with my colleague Daniel, who is working on the product development, and he said, unfortunately, it doesn't always converge. He was arguing those are some of the places where you need regulation and such instead. But I think that time to market question, I think, is increasingly easy to convince people that there's actually huge market benefits to taking the time to take these into consideration.
The Egal Playbook did a good job of laying out, the business case for responsible AI development and inclusive AI development. Everything from, making sure that you're developing and releasing, high quality services and products, avoiding retrofitting if something goes awry and there's a PR mess that you have to not only clean up on that level, but also retrofit the sort of system to make it better. But I also think there are other issues as well that we could think about in terms of making the business case for responsible AI. And going back to some of the points Matissa was making, so many companies have very clear mission statements. We've also made very strong statements on commitments to racial equity. And that's one thing that we often go back to when we're talking about the value proposition of following responsible innovation, responsible AI best practices. They can simply help you fulfill your mission, in terms of our own mission, organizing the world's information, making it universally accessible and useful. responsible, inclusive AI helps with that. So sort of tying back to that sort of mission-driven reason for it can be helpful. Product excellence, we sort of touched on that a little bit. Don't you want your product to work well for as many people as possible? And then something else, just to add on to the business cases that were so well put in the Egal playbook, retaining and attracting talent. I think a lot of people and probably Gen Z are looking at the mission statements, the ethics of companies when they're looking to find a job. The same is the case, and there are studies, I think McKinsey and others, that show that especially among Gen Y and Gen Z shoppers, they might not buy from a brand if they see even a marketing campaign that doesn't align with an inclusive message. So, there are those business cases too that you can keep bringing up, and I think show a value in terms of time spent on investing in responsible AI and inclusive AI in particular.
One challenge I wanted to mention as we think about all of this is, I think having built some machine learning models in the past for different companies, I think it's very easy to optimize an AI or machine learning model towards an easily quantifiable objective, which is almost always in a business context profit, right? And so when I was talking to one of my old managers about this last week, actually, and he pointed out that it's sometimes difficult for technical AI teams to think about these, higher, sort of moral, ethical objectives, and how do we quantify that? How do we get them to understand that you don't want to just optimize this AI model towards making as much money as possible, but there are these other things that we need to take into account along the way? And so I really like this idea of aligning the objectives, right? Whether that's through performance management or incentives, right? Making sure that all of the leaders, kind of all the way down to the data scientists and developers themselves, understand how important, these directives are to the success of the company and to sort of overall societal well-being.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. Recognizing when there is the recognition that the business case is there, then the leadership priorities can kind of naturally shift, right? And then what you're talking to around how to update perhaps kind of performance management systems so that, one thing we talk about in the playbook too is, to update performance management systems so that there's kind of more around building in ethics related to developing and managing AI systems, and that you're actually kind of assessed on those types of things. So it sets different expectations. So, translating those principles and perspectives down, I think that's really interesting. And, one important piece that seems around establishing kind of corporate governance structures, and I mentioned this briefly in the intro as well, was around establishing responsible or ethical AI principles. And we see this a lot with different companies that have developed different principles. There are some that also governments have developed some of these. Google has their responsible AI principles. And I'm wondering, Rena, if you can share a little bit about what was that process? When were those developed? How were those developed? And why were the particular principles selected? I'm just curious about how that looks.
Yeah, I mean, as you might be aware, we published our AI principles, 7 principles and 4 applications we will not pursue in June 2018. That is not to say that's when we put those, started putting those principles into practice. One reason I mentioned the mission earlier is that they were guided by a mission that was almost 20 years old at that point. There'd been a lot of work that went into those statements when they came out at that time. There have been a number of research papers coming out of Google Research, probably around 2016, looking at algorithmic fairness, looking at equality of opportunity, other ML fairness terms from the research context. And just a lot of, you might be familiar with 20% time at Google. It's sort of it's a very real thing in engineering, but also in terms of socially beneficial projects as well. A lot of Googlers sort of wanting to fulfill our mission as an AI first company with that messaging around the time of 2016, 2017, when a lot of research was happening in this space, and publishing a lot in this area, as well as the establishment of a centralized team, which is our responsible innovation team, which I sit on, to help put those principles into practice. Try to understand that, these are more than just statements. They're an ethical charter. They're almost like a constitution. How can they serve as guidelines as we make decisions, from the beginning of a research paper to the development of, say, a new product feature, or even consideration for a deal with customers or clients. But we really look at them in that way, as an ethical charter, a framework to make decisions against. And just to dive a little bit into that detail, if it's not too much, but we do have a process. Our responsible innovation team does help guide reviews, which are open to anyone at the company. There's an intake process that's open to anyone to get their research or product idea from a very, very early stage, either with consultations on ethics, human rights, law, product design, UX research, diving deep into algorithmic fairness, et cetera. And then moving forward with an analysis against the principles, again, using those as the charter, the framework, to offer guidance in terms of any mitigations that might be made, putting into practice some of the research tools that are available to sort of visualize and understand how data sets, how models work, are they aligned with the principles in terms of fairness and other aspects, and then moving towards decisions, not only among this responsible innovation team, but also with some of our senior most leaders. We do have a council in place of senior product executives who come in to help us decide when there is a proposal that might affect multiple product areas and potentially billions of users. So that was a snapshot, but I really wanted to get in this sense of how the principles are put into practice, and how they're considered, again, as a framework and a charter for decision making.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think one thing that really strikes me about Google's responsible AI principles is that you don't just say fairness, which is a principle you find, across most all responsible AI or ethical AI types of principles, but that you actually call out justice. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more around this. So, why did Google decide to focus on justice as opposed to fairness? And just any kind of thoughts that you have around that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's opposed to fairness. I think when you look at the principles, which you can see at ai.google/principles, when we talk about our principle number 2 is avoid unfair bias. And we do talk about, that we absolutely avoid unjust outcomes for people. So it's unjust in the larger sense of the term, in terms of non-discriminatory outcomes, impartial outcomes, et cetera. Fairness is a part of it, but we also make it really clear that there's no universal definition for fairness. Even in some of the ML fairness research that you can read online, and some of the tools that we've created, like the What If tool, you can find a lot of these tools on our People Plus AI research site, which is pair.withgoogle.com. We make it really clear that there are different types of algorithmic fairness as well. Again, demographic parity, equality of opportunity, et cetera. So they're not, we don't avoid that term fairness, but we try to offer that context. Also in terms of just outcomes and unjust outcomes, if you dive deeper into the principles, you can see how we shape them in accordance with international laws and human rights, along with frameworks like the UN's Declaration on Human Rights. So we need clear, widely accepted legal frameworks to help define the terms, and so that's really the context for the language that's used.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing I liked about calling out justice is that, justice is almost like a sub definition of fairness in a lot of the kind of academic language, but fairness can be somewhat, there's a lot of different definitions of fairness. So it can be a little bit more nebulous in terms of like what that actually looks like, whereas justice is really talking more about equity in a lot of ways, like very much so connected to equity. And I think that's why, it resonated with me so much. But I'm curious, Matissa, Augustine, if you have thoughts on that as well.
I'm not sure I have too much to add, except it is this big challenge, right? What is fair? And actually one interesting thing is what is fair is not unique to machine learning or AI, right? And in fact, I find it interesting that the struggle that machine learning has had with trying to address issues of fairness, sometimes it frustrates me because you go to the papers and they insist on measuring it all in mathematical formulas, right? But it was those mathematical formulas that led to sort of the realization of, oh, there's 33 different definitions of fairness. And under many circumstances, if you start with unequal outcomes to begin with, it's almost impossible to create an algorithm that will be fair to everybody, right? And that in some ways, while the computer scientists insist on proving that mathematically, it's actually revealing a fundamental reality of the world that we struggle with. And certainly within the HR world that I've been involved in, right, deciding what discrimination is and what that means, and how do we balance fairness and justice, right? And the challenges of the fact that sometimes trying to achieve and address long-term inequality means that the outcomes are unfair for some people in the short term to address long-term unfairness for other groups is revealing sort of much more deeper challenges within our own society. So I think it's a big challenge that machine learning is then forced to quantify, and it's that quantification, we're allowed to be kind of mushier when it's people making the decision, but it's an ever-present challenge.
Yeah, and I think that traces back to, I guess, one of the base issues with AI, right, is that when you're training it on past history, if that past history contains injustice and unfairness, then it's simply going to perpetuate that. Like you were saying, it's very difficult to get a model to create some sort of new future outcome that it's never really seen before, and defining that, like I said, like objective function, it is really tricky, and I think we're thinking even more about in the future.
And I think that you do actually even see sometimes the problems with that approach of taking that algorithmic approach to fairness and justice, because, and the classic example that I guess I can call out, right, is this algorithm that Amazon tried to create to recommend people to hire and was found to favor men. And part of the report, and some things that my colleagues like to point out, is that they spent 5 years trying to fix the algorithm instead of trying to understand what were the organizational processes that were creating that problematic training data in the first place, right? And so sometimes I think that focus on algorithmic fairness can actually be a distraction from learning the broader picture and trying to attract. On the other hand, I think there's also amazing opportunities for some of these AI algorithms to actually address key problems and unfair things, and that's the really fine razor's edge, and that's where we can tie back to the diverse teams, right? People who really understand what's wrong with the system and can use it as a very precise scalpel to try and address things and improve processes they know they are wrong, and try and keep out as much as possible the problematic training data that inevitably you have to tackle as well.
I think that goes back to, I was actually just thinking the same thing about diverse teams, and back to Augustine's point around how a lot of these potential issues are related to kind of what's in the data itself as a reflection of, the systemic issues and racism and sexism that we have in society. And so, having diverse folks on teams can help see different perspectives, identify potential issues that might have been missed from a team that was not diverse, and also comes to point out the need for multidisciplinary teams as well, with people that aren't just data scientists and engineers working on this. And I think, even us on this call, we come from like different educational backgrounds, and shows that, having those different kind of perspectives is really important in thinking about this issue too. And so, the role of business leaders in creating that environment that values different perspectives from different disciplines, I think is something that is important too.
I think too, going back to, I think a point that Matissa was making early in the discussion is also equipping those teams with tools that meet them where they are, where they're making these sort of decisions. So One thing that our extended team worked on this year and released was a responsible AI with TensorFlow workflow, and sort of placing the tools that get people to think critically about some of these issues as they're building ML models and systems while they're actually doing it. So trying to really think about how to equip people with the information they need to take societal context into consideration, take the different definitions of fairness that might exist with actual tools that they're using as they're making sort of real-time decisions, working in these systems, is an approach that we've been trying and taking as well. So going from like that sort of abstract and philosophical into the sort of practical is, one way to also scale that way of thinking to everyone, not only the people in the room sort of making the decisions, but on the ground in the hands of developers.
Yeah, definitely. Those are super valuable tools for sure. And we highlight some of those in the playbook, I think Ishta may have flagged the principles, but maybe she can also put the link to some of the tools or information on those in the chat too, if folks are interested. So I'm wondering how can companies inform how other organizations, whether governments or other companies, or even multilateral agencies like the World Economic Forum, formulate inclusive AI practices. So how, I guess, what should be the way that folks kind of collaborate in this space? How are people already collaborating? What else should leaders be doing to really advancing this, because it is a kind of industry-wide challenge in a lot of ways. Maybe Rena, do you mind starting with that one?
No, not at all. Beyond some of the tools that I was starting to talk about, we have a lot of open source tools, a lot of, that responsible AI with TensorFlow is out there to the world. A lot of our training that we use internally, like the machine learning crash course and a practicum on ML fairness, that's also available externally. So just having a lot of transparency and openness and hands-on tools are one way of doing it. Also just creating frameworks that other peers, other organizations can adapt for themselves. One example is model cards, which are, I don't know if people are familiar with those, but they're short documents. They report different aspects of machine learning models, from intent to intended use to performance metrics, et cetera. This came out of Google Research, was a research paper, so somewhat seeming abstract, but we pushed those forward. We released a couple of model cards for Google Cloud at the end of last year, and then have been working with cross-industry organizations like OpenAI, Partnership on AI, with industry peers, Salesforce, NVIDIA, others, and saying like, hey, this is a framework that you could try to use, you could adopt this. That type of approach to inclusive AI, responsible AI is not proprietary. I think also making it clear that this is in line with just better experiences for people in general that are beyond sort of organizational walls.
Matisa, do you have thoughts on kind of the role or the opportunity between collaboration and also with governments or with other organizations around kind of what's needed to advance change?
Yeah, I mean, that in some ways is the driving force behind the center that I've been a fellow with for the year, which is part of the World Economic Forum, which has a long-standing commitment to what they call multi-stakeholder capitalism, which is the view that companies have a responsibility not just to profit, kind of going against the shareholder capitalism view, and that companies have a responsibility towards society and towards their employees and that kind of thing. And so the organization has had a long-standing commitment to working on things, bringing together governments, nonprofit organizations, academia, and private businesses together. And so it has been a very rewarding year to do that, and that's been the effort of this project, is to bring together startups and companies and and nonprofit organizations, a bunch of academics, HR professional associations, and really sort of bring it all together. And I think, there's also the role and the advantage that I would say that the whole concern about fairness in AI, my understanding, having talked to people who are in computer science, right, is initially just kind of this cool thing. And I think the attention that was given to the Compass tool and the kind of potential societal ramifications of that tool were really a big wake up. And I think that there is a sort of growing recognition by organizations that this is part of their responsibility. And so I think that's the good news, is that we're at a moment right now where it seems like a lot of people are on the same page and want to do better and where we are, and kind of going back to the principles you were talking about before, right? There are lots of organizations that have established principles, but I think someone counted there's like 130 different declarations of AI principles, and now I think where we are, and that's just happened in the last 4 or 5 years, and so now where we are is kind of trying to come together to figure out, but what does that actually mean in practice, and that's where the focus of the projects we're doing are, and it seems great, right? Like I think one of the challenges is whether, and I don't know if it's necessary to coordinate every single work all over the world, right? It's great that Google's doing their own stuff as well, but we're beginning to pull things together and to coordinate it to kind of a comprehensive understanding of what this means. So.
Yeah, it's still, fairly early on in a lot of this, right? And so, which is exciting, but there's a lot of learning still happening. And so one thing that we discuss, speaking about kind of shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism, and one thing that we discuss in the playbook is kind of the potential role of CSR teams and kind of advancing inclusive AI and mitigating bias. So addressing societal bias, such as through promoting digital inclusion. Like I know Google.org has some things maybe Rena could share a bit about, but also supporting things like participatory data collection. So making sure that kind of communities have a role in how data is collected and are more empowered to kind of own that data. So thinking about, they're kind of like privacy considerations or concerns around how data is collected. And then also just kind of larger systems change, perhaps in areas that AI systems are being used in and developed. But I'm curious, what do folks think about this in terms of like, having this role for CSR teams versus what should be kind of more core business functions? And, how do we think about what should be within the role of those two different systems, and also within the larger context of thinking about, shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism? Any kind of thoughts from folks around that perhaps somewhat meta question? And I know we've talked about, I'll let you kind of chime in. I know we've talked a little bit about kind of CSR implications before, but any thoughts you have around that?
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't have as much experience with CSR in traditional corporations, but I think one of the coolest things we've been discussing at Haas recently is the idea of like B Corps or benefit corporations, right? And hopefully pushing more AI, small or large companies to push towards that world where, profit is not your only objective as a company, not just shareholder returns, also this responsibility to other stakeholders. And so I think when you incorporate those voices earlier on, it can be a lot better, I guess, because AI is so young right now, right? We have a chance to form this industry in a responsible way. And the more people that are thinking earlier on about, not just their core business objectives of profit is going to be better in the long term.
Rena, do you have any thoughts around kind of what could be like the responsibility of, not putting too much on necessarily CSR teams, recognizing that a lot of this is also kind of core to Google's business? I know we've talked a little bit about that before, but any thoughts you have around that?
We make it really clear that our responsible AI and inclusive AI work is not only happening in sort of people operations or HR, or only happening in the sort of CSR philanthropic part of the company. And that's been really clear even in terms of placing resources within sort of product areas within different parts of the company outside of those roles. Like, for example, I used to sit in people operations and DEI. but now sit within a different organization that advises across product and research. So making those types of commitments, but also partnering really closely with CSR sides of the house in terms of their partnerships, and making sure that we always are in tune with community advocates, creating open roundtables that lead to sort of co-creation around some of these ideas, and really listening versus and partnering versus having that be separate. And then again, just going back to company missions, the types of products that people have wanted to make and work at companies for that reason. People do align with those corporate statements and want to make those real. So understanding that that's also rooted in product excellence, data excellence, et cetera, I think is something to keep in mind as well. Sort of this idea of like putting your user first, no matter who they are. And that's achievable by understanding all of these users, listening to them, partnering with them for those outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. So I have one more question for folks. And so if others, and I see some questions from participants have already been rolling in, so please feel free to add your questions to the chat and we'll get to those in a minute. The last question I want to talk about, again, we coming from kind of the business school perspective, we're recognizing and seeing how data science is becoming an increasingly important area for business leaders and business school students. And thinking about how we can equip future business leaders that are kind of taking these courses to contend with some of these broader issues that we're talking about related to fairness, justice, equity, as they relate to kind of data and they relate to AI. I'm curious what you all think about, what are some of the ways that perhaps business schools should adapt to kind of these changing needs and, where the world is going as we kind of see increasing reliance and focus on data and AI. Augustine, I saw you already unmuted, so if you wanted to kick us off.
Yeah, no, it's just such a great question because I think Matissa referenced this, early on in the discussion, but when you see a lot of folks coming into business school that don't have a lot of experience of data or AI beforehand, I think their prior is that numbers and analytics are objective. They are just true and you just kind of do them and then you're done. And that notion, I think, just needs to be disabused as repeatedly and as early as possible, right? In our ethics class, we talked about some of the problems that various facial recognition systems should have been having in terms of not discerning certain people correctly, right? But I think we need to be having those discussions not just in our ethics classes, but in the classes where we're learning these techniques, right? I don't even think it's as important for MBAs to learn how to code, machine learning, as it is to help them understand both what are the upsides of this and then what are the downsides, right? What are the outcomes where this can go really wrong? And once you understand both of those sort of perspectives, then they're equipped to be making better business decisions and giving better direction and leadership to data and AI teams in the future to make sure we're avoiding those downsides and kind of going towards socially responsible outcomes rather than just perpetuating perhaps past inequities.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And it's interesting, I coming from a slightly different perspective because I teach in the business analytics program, but I teach in an undergraduate business analytics program. Some of my students are a little bit more straddling that line between being a business student and wanting to actually learn how to code and do the machine learning themselves. And so I think there, and this is not something that, and this is one of the things I'm sort of determined to go back to and help with is trying to figure out how to infuse those ethical considerations into all classes that teach machine learning. And a lot of it has to do with these things like model cards and data cards, where it becomes, if this is exactly what we know is the best practices in a company, then we should be teaching our students those best practices from the beginning, right? Which means every time you use a data set, you say, who is actually in this data set? What is the training data actually incorporate? How am I planning to use it? How could it be misused? I think oftentimes we end up, machine learning is so data hungry that especially at the educational level, there's sort of data sets of convenience that are found. And then it's just sort of like, oh, well, this is just an example data set, so we'll just use it and we won't query it too much. So really trying to have that practice of thinking about the implications there is important. But I think at the same time, I also think, and I agree that this should be part of the, increasingly, because AI is becoming such a central part, it should be part of the broader curriculum as well. It's one of the aims in the toolkit that we're creating for HR professionals, is that actually, machine learning is so fundamentally affected by the input that is put in terms of training data, and if it's supervised learning, the outcome that it's learning to predict or maximize, that it doesn't really matter all the math that's in between. That understanding whether or not you have quality data to start with, and understanding what the quantifiable outcome that had to be quantified as actually measuring, and what that means for what it's actually telling you. Those two implications are super important. And I think it's really, as well as all of the data privacy and bias things, are all considerations that sort of every person who's an executive should know. They don't need to know the math, but they should be able to query and ask the hard questions about tools regardless. So I think that education at both levels is super important.
And the human aspects of data. I feel like we're going down the line with all the unpeeling all of the layers that make a data set what it is and how it's used. There are other aspects that I think a lot of people might not be thinking of, like what are the labels on the data? Who labeled it? When were they labeled? Because sometimes the language used in the labels might be outdated or might reinforce unfair biases. And these are all of these layers that, when you're thinking about the best outcome for people, need to be unpacked and understood, like in a really comprehensive way. So yeah, beyond the math, data science beyond the math, I think would be a really, really good course.
Yeah, and that's something that we've talked about in these previous sessions, this brown bag too, is the importance of not devaluing the kind of social science aspect and the human aspect. Like, data is representing people, right? And to your point, Rena, around kind of labeling, there was some research around kind of popular image data sets and how labels on those image sets, I mean, these are labels on different people, and some of them are really subjective, labeling someone like a slob, for example, or like a mistress. Like, there were these, examples that were clearly objective. And if those are kind of fed into AI systems, they kind of continue to perpetuate this sort of these sort of biases that exist in our society and about different types of people. So moving over to some questions. So Allie Black has a question. Allie, if you are on the line, would you like to unmute and share? And I can also read it out loud, but I'll give you a second to unmute if you'd like to share your question out loud.
Yeah, at the time that I had asked this question, we had gone a little bit less in depth on kind of regulation, but I was curious if you guys see any particular role for larger entities such as like government having some say in like principles of inclusion using AI models, or some more like comprehensive regulation.
Yeah, I can say, I think that there definitely is a role for regulation. I think a number of the other projects that are involved with this group at the C4IR Center are tackling the regulation side. And I think, if we think businesses need help figuring out how to do this right, I think governments are even more overwhelmed on that front, really trying to figure out. And obviously, governments, despite their reputation, are not looking to stifle innovation by any means, right? The Canadian government, I can tell you, is very excited about the kind of positive strategic placement that AI has put the country, right? So they're trying to figure out how to do regulation in a way that really ensures the interests of society, but also encourages responsible use. And so I think it hasn't necessarily been figured out, but I think there's clearly a role, and the question is sort of figuring out the way to put those principles into practice.
Sorry, go ahead, Rena.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, if you go to ai.google/responsibilities, you'll see a number of different points of view, some of our responses to different white papers, and how we've suggested putting into practice different principles, as well as examples that we can give in terms of using some of the tools that I've mentioned today. So in terms of more safety, while also encouraging innovation. So yeah, if you want to take a look at that, you can go into some deep detail there with some specific examples.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'll mention is, I mean, Rena probably is aware of this as well, but I remember last time that a couple of the past times they brought the big tech CEOs in front of Congress. I think, especially from an American's perspective, it's somewhat clear that we might not have the right people asking these questions, right? The tech fluency, especially the AI fluency from the elected officials, maybe isn't where it needs to be asking the right questions and figuring out the right regulations. So I think while regulation needs to happen, it needs to be led by people who are familiar with the space, whether it's partnerships with academia, nonprofits, to make sure that knowledge is getting into the right sort of political hands.
I just say one other thing, which is I remembered we talked about this last week, is that the other benefit of regulation is that it does help clarify things and actually helps provide more security for organizations. So I know within the HR field that we have a lawyer who's part of the project community who just says it's just so risky right now for any company to adopt one of these tools because the implications are so unknown, right? And actually regulation would be welcome in helping to make sure that we understand which organizations are not working well, or create clear principles of what an organization needs to do, because that actually helps the innovation, will help companies actually adopt the tools because they have some understanding of where they won't get into trouble. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point for sure. There's still, unknowns, and it's huge investments to be making and developing and managing these AI systems, and regulation is coming. So, having more clarity around how is important for business leaders to be able to understand, what those risks are and how to navigate that in the future. So those are really good points. Stefanos also had a question. Stefanos, if you are on the line, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, guys. This is fascinating conversation. Yeah, I have a slightly different question. It's fascinating to see that we're talking about a 15.7 trillion market in less than 10 years. And what comes to mind here is that very quickly AI is becoming table stakes for a lot of up and coming companies. And as we kind of shift in general our business models more towards two-sided markets, taking advantage of network effects, one would argue that since good AI that is unbiased and socially responsible and inclusive takes time and money, it's almost like how do we see smaller enterprises that struggle, that have very limited resources, being able to afford to invest in good AI? So that's one question. And then secondary question there is that, and I'm just more interested in your thoughts. And secondary question is, what are your thoughts around secondary effects? Let's say, for example, a lot of the AI is used to personalize an experience or target advertisement. But what if we're reinforcing behaviors that are detrimental to that specific audience? Like, for example, promoting, sugar water, right, to people who already consume way too much sugar water, just to give you an example. Thanks. Too many questions, sorry.
With the first question, that's a great question, and it's one that comes up a lot in conversation. It's sort of like, yeah, of course, large corporations can invest in responsible AI teams and inclusive innovation teams, et cetera. And you have all of these resources. At the same time, there are a lot of, again, tools out there. That's what as I was saying earlier, safety isn't proprietary, responsibility isn't necessarily proprietary. How do we get a lot of the same tools that we use internally, a lot of the same visualizations, a lot of the same training that we use internally? What can we share so that other students, smaller operations, nonprofits, et cetera, can use some of these tools? So I think that sense of awareness of what's out there can be really helpful. And it does exist. So actually, this is a good call to action too, to make sure that we are getting these tools in the hands of entrepreneurs, smaller businesses, et cetera. In terms of the secondary effects, I think there's always, these issues of trade-offs and understanding, what decisions we're making in terms of how the outcomes of these systems might affect users. And this is where, too, all of that deep sort of user research, understanding what the downstream outcomes might be for really specific users comes in handy. Because I think sometimes, in my opinion, sometimes people are thinking a lot about the engineering and maybe not simultaneously the sort of downstream effects. And you're seeing that in a lot of our research and a lot of, again, these tools, visualization tools around data sets, understanding who you intend for these models to be used for, what products they might be used for. Like trying to do a lot of that pre-work hopefully will help build that critical thinking in terms of downstream effects, secondary effects, et cetera.
Great, thanks. Well, with the last 2 minutes here, we always have one question that we save for the end. And the question is, what is a recommendation that you would give to a business school student today? So I don't know who would like to start with that. Maybe Matisa, since you perhaps give more recommendations to business school students more often.
Recommendation to business school students today. Yeah, I mean, well, this is somewhat narrow, but I do think for a business analytics student today, actually, I think the thing that I try to pass on in my classes is that analytics is more than just machine learning, and that in fact there's a certain extent to which machine learning is taking the easy way out by just trying to have the machine figure it all out and make the decisions for you, and that there's power of data and analytics to understanding what's going on in your organization and improving your organization or process, and not simply optimizing. So that's my advice. Use other tools, not always. Machine learning is not always the answer.
I guess mine would be that AI doesn't equal automation. Like, I think people think that AI is going to make their lives easier, going to make their business processes easier, and that's not the case. You're going to have to be monitoring some of these secondary effects, just like you would with any other business process, right? Like, what is this putting out into the market? Is this an outcome we want to be achieving? Who is this hurting? But just keeping in mind that you can't just throw AI at something and have it be done. It's going to be more complex, and it will pay off in the long run, but it requires just as much, if not more, like intense thought and consideration as any other decision you make.
And I would just build upon that is to really understand, where AI lies in larger sort of business and societal contexts. I think we talk about all this potential and like what a big market is going to be created by AI, but like this is part of a continuum, sort of why I started out with like going backward in time to sort of product design issues. And this is part of a larger continuum. So understanding that where AI lies for you in terms of your journey as a business person, as a business student and a business leader, but also where it lies in that continuum of the history of business itself. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are all great. And I always like to end with a thought around how data is, it's not neutral or objective. And so recognizing the reflections that it has around the different issues related to equity and inclusion that we have in our society. So great. Well, thank you so much to our incredible speakers today. Really appreciate this wonderful conversation. And thanks to everyone who is attending. We'll be following up with some more information and hopefully getting some more information from folks around what they think, how business schools should adapt and need to change with kind of how things are progressing with AI. And we'll share more of that information in the coming weeks. But thank you so much for folks who attended the sessions, and we look forward to continuing this important conversation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.